Funding for this episode is provided by Capital Electric Cooperative. Since 1948, Capital Electric has provided electric service to customer owners across Burleigh and southern Sheridan counties.
In the mid-1990s, 1996, there was a major supermarket chain in western United States who decided they were going to change magazine industry for us. And rather than having a number of small independent wholesalers, they wanted a single supplier for the entire western United States. And it ended up being a bloodbath for the industry.
The Sakariassen family's impact to North Dakota began with Christian Sakariassen, who arrived from Denmark in 1881 and settled in Mandan. In 1920, his son John opened the Palace of Sweets, a small candy and magazine shop that grew into Saks News, a prominent distribution company. Through 3 generations, the Sakariassen family shaped North Dakota's reading culture, delivering books, magazines, and a love for literacy across the region.
First Sakariassen in North Dakota was my great-grandfather, Christian August Sakariassen, born in Jelling in Denmark. He came over to the United States in 1881 on a ship called the Castor, and he worked for a railroad in New Jersey. In the following year, 1882, he sent money home to his sweetheart. She came over. They were married in New Jersey in 1882. And the next year, they decided they were going to go out to Dakota Territory and homestead. They went to the Vermilion area and decided that farming was not going to be his occupation. And so a few years later, they packed up 2 kids that they had there and headed off to Mandan in 1885. Mandan was a new community, and he got a job working for the Northern Pacific Railroad. They had a 3rd kid, John Sakariassen, and in 1888, all 3 of those children died in a scarlet fever epidemic. And they reused the names of those kids for 3 of their other children that were born at the time. And then little Johnny became my grandfather, John Arnold Sakariassen. John Arnold Sakariassen, our grandfather, he was born in 1899, died in 2000. So he lived in 3 different centuries. He used to like to tell people that he was alive when the Wright brothers flew their flyer in 1903, and he himself flew on the Concorde over to Europe, the supersonic jetliner that people might remember. Quite a lot of changes over that period of time. He liked to act and sing. He was in lots of different productions in high school and then in community theater later. He graduated from high school, from Mandan High in 1917, and we still have the pennant that he had from his high school, from Mandan High. He wanted to go to college, and he wanted to become an engineer. 3 of his brothers ended up working for the railroad, like their father, but he wanted to go off to college and become an engineer. And in 1918, his older brother was over in Europe, in France, fighting in the trenches during the war. And he thought he could join the Student Army Training Corps, which is a predecessor to ROTC, and go to the University of Minnesota. And he went to the University of Minnesota in October of 1918. 1 week later, he came down with the flu epidemic, the Spanish flu influenza, and he spent months in a hospital and survived it. His father actually came and stayed with him at that hospital, and there was a story about him being delirious and jumping out a window, and his father grabbed him and pulled him. And when he came back to Mandan, after he had recovered, 1919, after the war was over, of course, He got a job working in a confection store, selling ice cream and candy to citizens in the community of Mandan. And he had the opportunity to buy another confection store that was coming up for sale. And he borrowed money from his father, bought the confection store, and he was in business. 1920, he opened the Palace of Sweets, and it was called the Palace of Sweets because it was in the same building that the Palace movie theater was. He was right next door. And everybody would go into the movies, but before they'd go into the movies, they'd have ice cream or candy or something in the store. One of the things he sold in the store that was very popular were magazines. And in 1920, actually, when he first opened the store, all the magazines in the United States at the time were sold through the American News Company, and it was a national distributor. It was like a wholesaler that would mail the magazines to each retailer, and it was a very cumbersome distribution system. Hearst Publications, William Randolph Hearst, they wanted to break out of the American News Company and do independent distribution, and some other publishers also wanted to do that. And they went around the United States talking to people to set up distribution for magazines as independent distributors. And they talked to John, to our grandfather, and he took on independent distribution of magazines in Mandan for 5 retail accounts. And that became the beginning of Sax News. In 1929, he moved the operation over to Bismarck. He bought out a restaurant called the Olympic that was on Broadway. He didn't want to become a restaurateur, so after about a year of that, he subleased the restaurant to Hempel's Grocery, and so there was a grocery store, and he had the Olympic sweet shop, so he had a confection store in there, but the basement was where they put all the magazine orders together, and they delivered out of that basement. So they would carry all these bundles of magazines and newspapers that they put together and invoiced in the basement, carry them up the stairs, load them up in a panel truck, and drive them to different retailers. So Sax News was in Bismarck, and they were distributing to all the retailers in Bismarck then. And mostly in those days, it was drugstores that were the big retail outlet for newspapers and magazines. So Sax News grew throughout the 30s and into the 40s quite a bit. My grandfather started delivering magazines to Dickinson. It was interesting living in a rural state like this to be able to cover that kind of territory by truck every week and bring those magazines to another area. Then he moved into Jamestown and expanded the business there. He bought the wholesaler in Minot, and eventually he rolled that into the Bismarck operation. So he expanded across North Dakota. One thing that happened in the late 30s, early 40s, the invention of the paperback book. Before that time, their books were all hardcovers, and they were expensive. But paperback books came out, and they were cheap. They were 15 cents. They were 25 cents. The idea was that these were going to be books that were disposable. You didn't have to hang on to it forever. And it was a real boom. They took off across the country. My grandfather, he saw this right away and got involved in the paperback book industry and started delivering those. Because we already had the infrastructure to deliver the magazines, the paperback books were easy to do. They worked the same way on the same kind of basis as the magazines did. They were fully returnable. So the retailers loved it. It was a guaranteed sale. They would return the books that didn't sell.
I always thought of my grandfather as being this very wise old man, and I had a lot of respect for him. I always called him grandfather. For some reason, I never called him grandpa. I just said grandfather. I loved the guy so much, but he was kind of grumpy. He was always careful not to show too much emotion, and he always expected a good day's work out of you. I can remember when I was first working in the office a few times, I would walk back into the warehouse and I would catch my grandfather standing behind some of the racks, peeking through the books to make sure people were working out in the office without them knowing that he was watching them. And I just thought, they're working hard anyway. It's not really necessary, but it was that old school kind of mentality.
My father was John Robert Sakariassen, always called Bob so that he wouldn't be confused with my grandfather, John Arnold Sakariassen. Sax News really was a family business. My dad started working for Sax News when he was a kid. He went into the Air Force after college. He went to UND to college, when ROTC, and he was stationed in North Carolina and then sent over to Korea. And he got to Korea right as the armistice was signed, so he never faced combat. And when he came back, he and his wife moved to Bismarck, my mother, Betty, and they started having kids and had 3 of us. But he went into the business with my grandfather, and he really changed the business in a lot of ways.
He became ill when he was in 8th grade with nephritis, which is a kidney disease. It's a kidney infection. So he spent a lot of time laying down in bed, and he would read comic books and he would read regular books, listen to the radio, but it kind of, I think, awoke a love and a passion of reading.
He really took on the paperback books in the 50s and introduced those to the teachers' convention. And at the time, teachers were horrified at the idea of books with paper covers on them. But they were so inexpensive that they were able to really bring those books into the schoolrooms, and kids had a good handle on those books. And so they became a big part of what was used in school.
One of the changes that my father brought about was that when grandfather ran the business, they worked 6 days a week. They worked Monday through Saturday, and they had Sunday off. And one of the things my father did as he became more and more involved in the business was he reduced the Saturday down to a half day. And he would go down every Saturday morning, and there would be a few other people working there. But he would always take my brother and I with. And so on Saturday mornings, he would want to do the work. And so he would just send us out into the warehouse. And then we would start reading books and comic books and magazines and everything else. And I remember every Saturday, though, we would take books home with us that we would take out of the warehouse. Of course, he would strip the cover off before we left. But no, we always had books. And magazines. Dad always would bring home magazines that he would read himself, but then take them back so that they could get their return credit, obviously.
Help tell the stories of Bismarck's past and become a financial sponsor of this program. Contact info@bismarckhistory.org to learn more.
Paul and I, we worked for Sax News in the summers, and I would work in the return room. Sometimes I would work at the town crier, but I would box. I wasn't good enough to scan them over the scanners, but I would unpack the boxes and stack them up. Paul, I think, worked more in the tie line, so he would work on putting the orders together, and I would work on all the stuff that didn't sell and came back.
My first job in Bismarck was working for Dan's supermarket, and then I went out for football in high school, and they didn't want to hold the job open until football was over. So I gave that up, but then I wanted to have a part-time job. And so in the afternoons, I would go down and I would work in the warehouse for a few hours a week. And that just carried all the way through high school to eventually, as you got towards, in a senior year or whatever, I was working probably 20 hours a week.
After college, my dad was hoping I would join the business. And so I eventually did. And in 1980, I came to work full-time at Sax News, and I worked doing distribution work. So I would try to figure out where the orders ought to go and work with those computers and trying to get all that automation. I remember early on when I was working at Sax, and I got a phone call because Dad was not in town at the time. And the call came to me fresh out of college from Hugh Crocker, the CEO of TV Guide. And he said, "We are going to turn over the entire TV Guide distribution in the Fargo-Moorhead area to you guys." And that meant that Independent News, who distributed in Fargo, would essentially be out of business. So we bought out Independent News, and now we were in the Red River Valley, and the company grew in a huge way and expanded out into northern Minnesota. In the 1990s, mid-1990s, we finally bought King News in Grand Forks, and that was the last of the other wholesalers. And so we expanded to the entire state of North Dakota by the early and late 1990s, and well into Minnesota by that time.
TV Guide basically decided who would get which editions. It was the number one top-selling magazine of all the magazines, and it was a digest size, so they had pockets at every single checkout. We used to get thousands of copies of TV Guide, and our sell-through percentage was the highest of any magazine we had. Everybody had to have TV Guide.
In the 1960s, they got involved in the bookstore business. The paperback books were going great guns, and a lot of the wholesalers, particularly Midwest wholesalers, Central States and Mid-America periodical wholesalers, got involved in opening their own retail stores. And many of these stores were called town crier stores, using the old town crier from, hear ye, hear ye. And Dad and Grandpa built a bookstore. They had it down on the southwest corner in the old Logan and Little building. It was in the Little building, actually. And that store opened in 1965. And it was really the first major bookstore in Bismarck. There were 4 town crier bookstores in North Dakota. It was Bismarck, Minot, Jamestown, and Fargo for a while. 1984, there was a huge fire in the town crier bookstore in Bismarck. And the fire spread, and I remember getting the phone call, get down here, from our insurance agent, get everything out of that building before it burns. We all tore down there to the bookstore, and they called Paul, and he showed up, and some of the workers at Sax News brought trucks over, and we were running in there and pulling out books and coughing through the smoke. It was insane. I mean, it was very dangerous trying to get all those books out. The store was eventually reopened and survived for a couple more years, and then the chain stores showed up. And so by the late 80s, it really wasn't profitable to continue running the retail stores. And so they closed one by one. And sadly, Paul and I were kind of the ones who went and hauled all the stuff out of those stores and closed them down. A really sad event. People kept coming up to us and saying, "Oh, we're so sad that the town crier closed. We miss that store. You guys should open another bookstore." And yeah, just kind of dangerously, Paul said, "Hey, we really should open another bookstore." And that was the spark for Maxwell's Books in the Kirkwood Mall.
For us, the benefit of owning a bookstore is that we not only got the retail sales of it, but we also got to sell to it from wholesale. So we would kind of double dip into the profits that we could make on what we sold. So it was really beneficial for us to own a bookstore and to operate a bookstore. The store itself was very well connected in the community with teachers. I remember we really tried hard we hired the first employees that we had, 2 or 3 of them were actually teachers, because we were trying to garner more business selling to the schools and to book fairs and that kind of thing.
I remember going in to confess to Dad that we'd hired an architect to design a bookstore, and he was kind of angry that he thought he'd gotten out of that business. But my grandfather, he thought, "Oh, a bookstore. I love bookstores," he would say. Our kids even worked for the bookstore. Both of Paul's kids sold books at the bookstore. Karen was the manager. Our son, Alex, he worked at the bookstore when he was in high school. So it was always a family business. But we knew that it wasn't going to be long for the world, and told our kids, "You're not going to work for Sax News. It won't last that long."
It was a wonderful store, and we were fighting against not only B. Dalton's in the mall, Walden Books had moved from Gateway Mall to the mall. And then we got word that there was a Barnes & Noble that was going to open across the street from the mall. We started to feel the effects of all that. We ran the numbers and looked at it, and we just decided, you know what, going forward, there's just no way that we're going to be able to keep this as a going concern. So the decision was made to buy our way out of the lease and close the store.
So Paul and I gradually took over ownership. Dad would gift us stock. It was a C corporation. He and grandfather had converted the business from a partnership to a C corporation back in the 1960s. And so he would transfer as a gift stock to Paul and me over a series of years. But we took over management completely probably in the year 2000, 2002. We had such good people working for us at Sax News. It made running that business very smooth, very easy for Paul and I to transition into taking over the business and operating it. So I would say in the 2000s, we owned and ran the business. In the mid 1990s, 1996, there was a major supermarket chain in Western United States who decided they were going to change the magazine industry for us. And rather than having a number of small independent wholesalers, they wanted a single supplier for the entire Western United States. There was no way the magazine distribution industry was geared up to handle that. Even the largest magazine wholesalers couldn't handle something like that. And it ended up being a bloodbath for the industry. At the same time, the magazine industry was suffering from new technology. I mean, the computers were brilliant for making the magazine wholesale industry more efficient, but they spawned the internet. Print media survived the invention of the phonograph in the 1800s. They survived the invention of motion pictures in the early 1900s, survived the invention of radio, the invention of television. We were competing against the record industry, the movie industry, television. It was people's leisure time that was valuable to us. We survived all of that. What we didn't survive was the invention of the smartphone and social media. And magazine sales plummeted, starting in the late 1990s and into the 2000s.
We had a good background and a good reputation in the country because of the service that my grandfather and father had done over the years. My father was still active with us throughout most of the turmoil that we were dealing with in the competitive market. And he was very supportive. He still would come into the office most every day and want to know what's going on and discuss. And I think a lot of what Eric and I came up with in terms of how to proceed with this business came out of a lot of the discussions that we had among the three of us. But it was tough.
The saddest day in my life was the day that we signed the papers to sell the business, and I had to tell our employees that we were closing Sax News and that more than half of them were going to lose their jobs.
The decision to sell Sax News wasn't really a decision. By the time it became necessary, it wasn't a decision. It was a have to do kind of thing. We just could not sustain the operation. The cash flow wasn't there. The profit margin wasn't there. We realized that we were really going to be in some serious trouble. And we still tried. We still scraped through our partnership with the news group. We were able to gain the technology necessary to make the scan-based trading work. It's just that we couldn't, no matter what we did, we could not sell enough product to keep it going as a going concern. So ultimately, I called up Dakota News, and I spoke to the owner of Dakota News, and I just said, look, I don't know if you are looking for an acquisition or not. And they had been active in acquiring other companies. They had just bought Minneapolis distribution, and they had bought part of the distribution in Iowa. And he said, well, yeah, he said, let's talk. And so we went down and met with them, and things worked out. They were quite generous and helpful. And they were not easy people to deal with because they were pragmatic, but they were fair.
We sold the business in 2017, Paul and I did, to a good friend of ours in South Dakota. At that time, there were only 10 wholesalers left in the country. All the stuff my dad did, it took 2 of us to fill his shoes. So Paul took over. Paul was the president of CSDA. Paul was the president of MAPTA. I ended up being the president of Bismarck State College Foundation. I was appointed by Governor Schaefer to be on the Governor's Advisory Council on Libraries. I was a part of the trustees for the Bismarck Public Library, and then the Bismarck Public Library Foundation. I was on that board. So I served a lot in the community. Paul served a lot in the magazine industry, but it took 2 of us to fill my dad's shoes.
I think Sax News had a huge impact, though, on literacy and reading. And I think it was not only through the efforts of grandfather starting a company that distributed, but I think also through the efforts of my father, who really pushed the idea of reading, was kind of a life work. And then Eric, who's kind of worked in the community with the libraries and everything and done such a fabulous job with keeping the family tradition going.
Help tell the stories of Bismarck's past and become a financial sponsor of this program. Contact info@bismarckhistory.org to learn more.